Thanks for listening to the Adulting is Easy podcast, everybody, where we make adulting easier by making money easier. This is your host, Lauren. As always, I want to ask you, please rate and review, subscribe, all of the above, if you can safely do so. I'm joined today by Jessica Mauser. By trade, Jessica is a top producing commercial real estate broker with 17 years of experience in leasing and sales of shopping centers and over $350 million in transactions. By night, she's a rookie investor building an opportunistic portfolio that currently includes a vacation rental, a bit of multifamily, and an attempt at commercial real estate. Thanks for joining me, Jessica.
Thanks for having me on. I'm super excited to be chatting with you today.
Me too. And I do want to let everybody know this episode is brought to you all by Steadily Landlord Insurance. Steadily covers so many different kinds of properties: single family, multifamily, vacant, restorations, apartment buildings, condos, and even manufactured homes. Also Airbnbs and VRBOs, those short-term rentals. If you rent property to others, please support this podcast by clicking the link in the show notes and getting a quote today. So our goal is to make adulting easier for listeners by discussing a personal finance topic, since managing money is a big part of adulting today. Jessica, you and I are going to talk about your investing journey, and I definitely want to touch on building this rental portfolio out of state.
Yeah.
I'm curious, though, with being in commercial real estate for like your job, what made you go residential?
Barrier of entry. I mean, that's really what it comes down to is even if you have $1 million of 1031 exchange monies, which is cash, the barrier to entry in commercial real estate is significant. And it also takes a lot more capital, and it's a lot more capital intensive in ownership. And having been so involved in so many commercial real estate transactions, I am kind of like eyes wide open to that. And so it made more sense as my first couple transactions to be more opportunistic and invest in multiple assets that had value add opportunities versus one asset that I was probably less likely to find some value add.
Got it. That makes total sense. Can you tell us then about what your real estate portfolio looks like right now?
Yeah, so we had 2 residential homes in California that we sold and traded into 3 separate properties. Picked up 1 vacation rental. I picked up 2 units in South Florida and in escrow on 2 more units in the Minneapolis area.
So what made you go then from California elsewhere?
The great question. California is, as most people know, a very tax-heavy state, and it also doesn't offer much in terms of landlords and protections, in terms of evictions and things like that. So having been very versed in our moratoriums around California and understanding to the highest degree possible of what landlords can and cannot do, I just wasn't comfortable holding more, especially residential real estate in California.
So did you have any specific situations where you just looked around and were like, I got to get out of here? Did you have any evictions or squatters or anything like that?
Yeah, a lot of that. And it wasn't properties I necessarily owned, but it was properties that I had to coach my clients through, right? So they would come to me and say, okay, well, I've got this tenant. They haven't been paying rent. And I can't go to court because there's eviction moratoriums in place. And they ended up being 3+ years until they were able to get the tenant out of a space. And I knew I do not have the cash flow to support a property for 3 years, making no rent or very little rent, and then to be left with a property because they haven't been paying that was trashed. So seeing that multiple times made me very conscious of what is happening and how important it is for you to have rights as a landlord.
That is such a long time. That is so much money.
It's a very long time. And the worst part is I have 2 clients and friends that are both real estate attorneys, and both of them, even as attorneys, had this happen to them, and they can absorb their legal fees because they are their own attorney. I would have to come out of pocket for those fees, right? And so in the state of California, to evict somebody is about $25,000 when it's all said and done. And you've also loss of rent in that time frame. And then on top of that, you still have to go through the time process, right? So if it takes you 6 months, that's pretty quick. and the jurisdiction I live in, the sheriff has to serve, and there's a backlog of evictions.
Yeah.
And so once you get your judgment, it still takes upwards of 4 to 6 months to even have your judgment served. And that is on top of everything else. It just wasn't a place I was feeling safe,
Yeah.
given the statutes of, limitations and everything else.
Yeah. So once you decide you're going to look outside of California, that's still a big country and frankly, a big world that you could invest in. I guess you narrowed that down because you went for more landlord friendly states. Is that kind of how you started?
Yeah. And so we traveled quite a bit. And actually, during COVID, we had changed in our flight from Maui to Miami, is what happened, because there were so many lockdowns and you couldn't get into Hawaii, and we just weren't going to take the risk. We were like, well, where else is warm in the continental US?
And where are there no COVID restrictions?
Yes, it was that bush league. I promise you, it was that bush league. And so we loaded up the family, we got on an airplane, we showed up in Miami. This was January of 21 or December of 20, actually. And we get into the airport and like the mariachi bands are going, people are doing bar. I mean, we left SFO. We were the only ones in the airport. We were the only ones on the flight. And then we show up in this, what feels like a whole nother country. And my kids are like, why is everything normal here?
Yeah.
They hadn't had people in a year, right? Like it was crazy.
Yeah.
And so we spent 2 weeks down in the Florida Keys, and the interest grew from there. So then we took a second trip, drove up into Miami, and started looking actually at industrial real estate. That was where we'd started, was, hey, can we buy some warehouse buildings here? Because that's what we know. And we started just learning that Miami market. And we saw, some discrepancies between the kind of the same things we see here in the Bay Area happening in Miami with the residential and commercial and the barriers of entry. And so we realized these markets were very similar, and we just started to build the thesis right there. It's, we know it's a port city. We know it's a major metropolitan. Okay, well, where do you have gaps in employment and housing? Where are people living who have good jobs? And that's kind of how we ended up in the Florida.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you said earlier that you had these 1031 funds. Can you just explain what that means?
Yeah. So if you own a property that is an investment property, it doesn't apply to personal residences or primary residences. What you can do is it's a 1031 tax deferred exchange. And so what you're doing is you're transferring your tax basis to the next property. So you're not paying capital gains in that moment. You will have to eventually, but you can kick the can. And so we're deferring our tax capital gain that would have occurred on the properties we had here in California.
And you never get the money, right? So when you sell property, you sold those 2 properties in California. That cash, yeah, but that cash goes somewhere, and then a certain amount of time to use that cash for other stuff.
So yeah, we had 45 days from the date we closed escrow to identify the property we were going to buy next. So you actually get to identify 3 properties, but you must close within 180 days on one of those 3 properties. And so we actually had identified our first trade right away. That one was really smooth. We identified our second trade pretty quick, but we didn't use up all of the funds, there's 2 requirements in a 1031. First, you must use all the cash you came out with. And 2, you must buy a property or properties of equal or more value. Yeah. And so we had, in our second trade, we partially were able to fulfill, but then we were left with a small chunk, and then that rolled us into a third property that we fulfilled the end obligation on the 1031.
Okay, and you said two of them were in Florida, one is in Wisconsin. Is that what you said?
Actually, other way. So I have 1 property in Florida, but it's 2 units.
Okay,
and then 1 in Wisconsin that's a single unit, and then in escrow on a duplex in Minnesota. So just outside in Minneapolis, actually. So on the way up to our Wisconsin place.
Yes, I did an Airbnb swap where I went and stayed at an Airbnb, and somebody came and stayed at mine, and it was in Wisconsin. And I, being from Florida down here, I was like, oh, like there's Minnesota, like right there. But I don't know. I mean, I know where it is on a map, but it's really, really right there.
It's really, really right there. Like really right there. It's nuts. Like, and in Florida, you don't have that because you don't have any other states. Like
No,
that.
no, no. Like I gotta
Even in
drive
California,
hours.
yes,
Yeah.
it would take me like the shortest distance for me is, 3.5 hours or 4 hours to get into Nevada, to get into Reno, right?
Yeah.
But if I go 5 hours north, I barely make it to Oregon. If I go 5 hours south, I barely make it to LA. So like I kind of have that same landlocked feel.
Yeah.
And actually, the first time I went to Wisconsin, I thought I was going to Minnesota. That's so embarrassing. But yeah, and then I was like, oh my gosh, I just crossed a river after
Yeah.
20 minutes and I'm now in Wisconsin. Okay,
Yeah.
here we are.
And that's the Mississippi. Okay.
It is
That blew,
the
I'm like,
start of
I
the
know.
Mississippi.
I
Yeah, that's
know.
like the start of the Mississippi.
So crazy.
It
I
is.
was like,
Yeah.
that's mind-boggling. But
Yeah.
sorry. Anyways, so I digress. So which are the short-term rental and which are long-term rental then?
So short-term rental is Wisconsin. That's my lake house.
Okay.
And then right now I have long-term renters in my Florida property. One of those two cottages I'm planning to swap to a short-term rental this summer, which will be a really nice like case study scenario because I'll keep one with my long-term renter and there one is short-term and just be able to match up on my P&L. Like, does it make sense? Is it more, management intensive? Thus, it ends up pulling off the P&L. So I'm pretty excited to go through that exercise later this year.
I like that. We have a duplex where one side is short term, one's long. And then we have a 6 unit apartment building where we kind of have a mix as well, kind of for that same reason. A little bit of diversification, a little bit of leveling
Yeah.
out the cash flow, but mostly to kind of test things and see which is better in a lot of cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one we're in escrow with, right, that we're getting into escrow here is right next to University of Minnesota. And so I think that's going to end up being more student housing, which I think will be
Cool.
interesting mix in there as well. So
Yeah, I love it. So the place in Wisconsin, then how long have you had guests there? Like how long have you had it? How's it performing?
Haven't had guests yet. So we bought that one as, we're thinking, okay, worst case scenario, we use this as a second home.
Yep.
But when we actually purchased it, it had income flowing through it already. It was already used as a vacation rental and it was sold to us fully furnished.
Yep.
She, wasn't being ran with a true P&L. So it's a little hard to like kind of really get down to what she was making, but we decided to do some updates. So we are currently, actually our contractors up there right now, I keep getting pictures, adding, a fireplace and doing some other items on the house. And then
Nice.
it will be ready just after Christmas. So we'll start renting it again. Kind of January is the plan to get it back out there and performing again.
Got it. And so you have two long-term tenants then in the Keys.
In the Keys, yeah. So I've got two long-term tenants. I have one that has a lease through summer, one who's month to month, but he's been there 4 years. So I have no intention of messing with those tenants at this point in time, especially with this potential over there in Minneapolis, because that one is vacant right now. So I'm going to need to get renters into that one fairly quickly. So my focus will go from finishing the construction in the short-term rental right now. That'll be done hopefully in the next 2 weeks. And then I'll flip straight on over to Minneapolis and get those houses on the market and ready, kind of January 15th once we close.
Got it. So the Isla Mirada places, what jobs do those tenants have?
Yeah. So one works as a commercial fisherman and others in hospitality.
That adds up. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So you've got, and that's one thing I really liked about that market is there's so much vacation rentals and so many second homes. There isn't any workforce housing. So everybody's coming in from Homestead. So your average commute is an hour long and there isn't workforce housing. So if you can rent something for 2,000 to 3,000 a month, that's a steal in that market. And so even for a long-term renter, you're talking significant monthly income on very small units with a backlog of renters who want to be there. And so for me, I found safety in just the scarcity of real estate. And I know scarcity of real estate. That's what I do for a living. So I really liked that I had not just the scarcity of real estate and a lack of real estate for workforce, but then there's also that vacation aspect to it too. So you've got two plays for the property, no matter what. You're not just pigeonholed into a vacation property. There's also jobs that need
we have a similar situation with our 6 unit as well. So I know that Key West has, I think, like permits. What's the deal in Isla Mirada? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, so same thing. A lot of Monroe County, they all kind of run. It's supposed to be one renter every 28 days, depending on where you're at in terms of zoning.
Okay.
So we'll end up doing. My goal is to actually focus us into seasonal rentals and tap into the northern market. So it's your Canadians coming down because they're, these are single story right next to the beach. They're great for 1 month to 2 month or 3 month
Okay.
type rentals. So my goal is to not get into the weekly rentals in Florida. I'd like those to be more monthly or seasonally rented. And then I'll do weeklies up at my lake house because Wisconsin is definitely a shorter season. And that's a more seasonal rental. So that one I've got, my summer season, which is big because it's on a
Yeah.
lake. I have a dock. So that one will be weeklies during the summer. And then hunting is actually a big season up there. And so in the fall, you get a lot of hunters that use weekends and things of that nature. So I should get a pretty good push summer and fall through that property, but that one will be more true short-term rental.
Nice. I like it. So you're going to end up with student housing, a
Yeah.
long-term tenant, month-long to seasonal rentals, and weekly rentals. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I just will just go across the board. We'll figure it out.
Yeah, I love it. No, I think that's great. And I had a guest on recently to talk about having he has long term and short term, and I have long term and short term. And I like to have a little bit of that diversification. I like the short term rentals better for a lot of reasons. I'm better at that than I am at being a landlord, and there's a lot of things that go along with it. But I do like as of yet, I like having the mix.
Yeah. I'm excited to kind of get my hands into all the different buckets. Just because I've done commercial real estate for so long. I know that upside, inside out. And so there is something that's kind of attractive to being on I think there's I want to say it's more creative when you get into the residential side and you're dealing with, it's a different, beast altogether. But there is some creativity, especially in short-term rental space, because, you're designing the
Yep.
experience. And I find that to be really cool. So I'm excited to mix it up.
Yeah, totally agree with you there. So, what about plans for the future? I mean, you outlined kind of your short-term plans for the Isla Morada place, Wisconsin, Minnesota. Do you think
Yeah.
you'll stop there? Do you have future plans beyond that?
I'll keep going. I mean, it's turned into now. It was really hard, I'll say. And I think this is the spot. It's actually for anybody who's on Twitter. There's this guy called the Strip Mall guy. He's great. He is an investor in strip centers, retail strip centers. And his comment today was like, you just have to start small. He raised $400,000 on his first raise, and now he's raised something like 140 million cents. And so it's taken so long, I feel like, to get to this point where you start making those first investments. And now that I've gotten down, I'm like, oh wait, okay, I can do this. So I feel like I've hit like that point where you're like, all right, I got it now. Yeah. And so you become more and more opportunistic with each acquisition. You kind of get under your belt. And so I'm definitely looking to keep the train rolling, and it'll be, I'd like to get some more commercial under the belt, and I'm not sure exactly. It'll probably be Bay Area where I joint venture with somebody because it's tangible and I know that here, and then hopefully be able to incorporate that, whatever that thesis is, probably in Florida, maybe Wisconsin or Minnesota. It just depends on what presents itself.
Are your kids aware that you are buying places elsewhere?
Yes and no. Some of my 10-year-old, yes, because he actually was a big part of the conversation in buying Wisconsin. Something we were talking about water in the lower basin states and how that is such a big deal in California and Arizona and what that means. And he goes, so does Florida not going to have any water? We're like, well, it's actually the opposite problem, a little too much saltwater water. And so one thing that he did as we were doing our due diligence is we had him study where the largest aquifers in North America are. And he was able to deduct that under, the Dakotas and Minnesota and into Wisconsin and under Alberta and Saskatchewan is one of the largest underground aquifers. And he's like, wow, there's going to be plenty of water there. We're like, yeah, that's a big part of our investing thesis for the long term is population bases have to have water. And if they don't have water, guess what happens? You have a mass movement across the geography. And so he was part of that original kind of due diligence conversation of like, why is water significant in investing? And so, yeah, to some extent, like they kind of know, but not, to the degree that it's starting to turn into.
Yeah, I was just
I also fix
curious.
up houses. Yeah. They know I sell real estate. Dad sells real estate and we do this commercial, these big buildings. But now that it's more tangible things that they can go to, like they're coming to
Yep.
the Wisconsin house for the first time in a couple of weeks. So that'll be cool for them to see, like, no, that like this is what you do. And they're also going to go see the house we're in contract in Minnesota. So like they're going to start to really be part of what's happening, which I think will be really cool.
Yeah, that's cool. That's fun. And I love that you had him like totally involved. So that's cool. So we talked about what your plans are for the future. I really want to ask about investing out of state and if you could get into were there any nerves with it and just generally what advice do you have for people that are in maybe a very expensive area or really just for whatever reason should really be looking out of state?
Yeah. So I definitely, if you would have asked me 3 years ago if I would buy things out of state, I probably would have him and hawed a little bit. But given the environments that have popped up and the amount of work from home and flexibility that's become part of everyday life now, and also the tax consequences have continued to really hamper, especially you talk about a state like California where a wealth tax is being kicked around, right? And it's like, okay, do I really want my money locked into California in a wealth tax on the long term?
Wow.
Probably not, and
Okay.
so you start to see all these pieces kind of moving around, and it became very apparent that I needed to, if I wanted to be strategic about the money I was making, paying California 13.5% right off the top on a long-term basis probably wasn't going to be where I wanted it to be. And so that's what pushed me personally over the edge was the combination of things. And so knowing that I could also take money out of California and invest and get better returns in other places is also kind of a nice kick. And what held me back previously from wanting to take money out of California was appreciation. And so I was kind of stuck on this. Well, California appreciates better than any other state, but as we've seen the last 3 years, all rules have left now. If you look at Texas, the appreciation has been astronomical. If you look at Arizona, appreciation is astronomical. You look at Florida, astronomical. So markets shift and move. And again, it kind of goes back to population shift. And so as time has gone on, I kind of wore into this like, okay, wait, I'm getting a tax saving by eventually being able to move my income out because one of these I'll make a primary residence at some point. So, okay, I've got now a roadmap to shaving off 13% right off the top, depending on
Amazing.
what I'm doing. Yeah. And then you talk about the law side, the legal side of owning real estate elsewhere versus being a California owner. And then, you realize it's really not as scary as maybe I had initially thought. And real estate is kind of real estate. If you understand the thesis of what you're buying and why you're buying it, and you know how to underwrite, numbers, and you know how the financing applies, you can kind of just pick up and move the business plan. And so once I kind of got over that hump, I think it was a little less scary. And it's really just building then your network to support your real estate activities, right? So it's having the handyman or the real estate agent or the CPA that understands the tax laws in wherever it is you're owning and buying and running tax returns through.
Which you're going to need a team even if you're investing locally.
Locally. Totally.
So,
Exactly. It's just a matter of networking and resourcing to build that team elsewhere.
yep.
Yeah. And I think what's amazing about it is, like I was mentioning kind of at the top of the show, is you can have $1 million. It's funny. You see people on Twitter all the time. If you had $1 million, what would you do tomorrow? I'm like, guess what? It doesn't go that far.
No,
It doesn't. It's not exactly what you think it is. I promise you that.
no.
And so when you look at what I was able to take 2 properties and spin into 3 properties with 5 units, and I could have bought a fourplex too. I mean, that was the other property that I was closely looking at. So I could have upwards of 7 units with the same that I had 2 in California. And I can tell you that my gross income from those properties is 3 to 4 times what I was getting out of my California properties.
Yeah.
So it seems scary because you're not getting the appreciation. But if you can find markets you feel comfortable with, and there are really good synergies, whether that's scarcity of real estate in that market, whether it's that it just has good market fundamentals because maybe you have a port nearby. I think you can copy and paste your thesis into markets that might be create a better barrier of entry for you,
That
or
makes so
lack of
much
barrier
sense.
of entry.
Yep. So, do you have anything else to add before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I think if I could add anything is like you got to jump in sometime. So, might as well don't be crazy, but you got to make a start. So, if you're prepared and you know how to underwrite and you've got the cash, there's no time like the present. You gotta make the move at some point. So, and once you do, it'll feel good. You just got to get that first one out of the system.
Yeah, you got to get started and you got to get learning,
You have to
right?
get started. I think that's the hardest part, is getting started. So that would be my advice. If you know your thesis, you feel good about it, and you've got the money, and you understand the financing, and your numbers work, you got to make a start somewhere, and
Yep,
it doesn't have to be big.
totally agree. So, why don't you tell people how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah. So you can get in touch with me on Twitter. I think I'm at 925CRE or Jessica Mauser. And then I'm also on Instagram, Jessica.Mauser, Mauser. And then you can find me pretty much just Google me, Lean Associates, Jessica Mauser. All kinds of things will pop up, I'm sure. That's where you can find me on the daytime, slamming the commercial real estate, retail shopping center, and investment sales.
Got it. I will put all of that in the show notes. Everybody, you can follow me on Twitter at Adulting is Easy. I started a YouTube channel too, so please subscribe to that. You can email me at realadultingiseasy@gmail.com. My Instagram is adultingiseasyreal. Thanks again for listening, everybody. Hopefully, Jessica and I have made adulting a little easier for you.